The president's lawyers have one more full day to try to figure out how to defy a very clear and simple law that no one has ever defied. It is the law that empowers the chairs of the House and Senate tax writing committees to demand, not request, demand from the IRS any tax return that they want to see. The law does not put any limitations on that power. I've known about that law since I worked on the staff of the Senate Finance Committee in the 1990s, and I thought I knew everything about that law until Harvard economics professor Lawrence Summers' new op-ed piece in the Washington Post that has just been put online tonight. Professor Summers was the head of the National Economic Council for President Obama, and he served as Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. And he has something very important to teach about this law. And as I've mentioned before, the law was written in 1924, and it says that when the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee demands a tax return from the IRS, quote, the secretary shall furnish such committee with any return or return information specified in such request. The law was written to apply to the Treasury Secretary since the Internal Revenue Service is part of the Treasury Department. But in his op-ed piece, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers says the Treasury Secretary should have absolutely nothing to do with Chairman Richie Neal's demand for the Trump tax returns because the Treasury Secretary years ago specifically delegated this responsibility directly to the Commissioner of the IRS. Larry Summers writes, the appropriate response of the Treasury Secretary is very clear. Under a long-standing delegation order, the Secretary does not get involved in taxpayer-specific matters and has delegated to the IRS Commissioner as follows, quote, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue shall be responsible for the administration and enforcement of the Internal Revenue laws, end quote. Moreover, this is not a delegation that is readily revocable. Federal law provides that if the Secretary determines not to delegate a power, such determination may not take effect until 30 days after the Secretary notifies the tax writing and other specified committees. So for the Secretary to seek to decide whether to pass on the President's tax return to Congress would surely be inappropriate and probably illegal. Probably illegal. I would surely not have done it. Rather, I would have indicated to the IRS Commissioner that I expected the IRS to comply with the law as always. And joining us for an exclusive interview, Lawrence Summers, the former Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton and former director of the National Economic Council under President Obama. Currently, he serves as an economics professor at Harvard University. Professor Summers, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. You have taught me something once again. I am used to taking notes when you speak, but I did not know that the delegation from the Treasury Secretary to the IRS Commissioner on matters of tax issues like this was actually in writing, and that it's a formal delegation, and there's a formal process for revoking that delegation.
That's right. You know, it's one of the first things my general counsel told me when I became Treasury Secretary was any individual tax matter affecting any individual taxpayer, you are under no circumstances going to be anywhere near. And that applies to a request of this kind, and for good reason. It's the essence of the integrity of the tax system that politically appointed officials not be involved in these matters, and that's why there is a delegation to the head of the IRS, and it wouldn't have ever occurred to me and wouldn't have occurred to the Treasury Secretaries who I served under or the Treasury Secretary I served with to become involved in an individual taxpayer matter, much less an individual taxpayer matter involving the President of the United States.
And so and the part that I didn't realize is that this is actually written and in effect codified within the Treasury Department. And so what you're telling us is if Secretary Mnuchin does want to be the one decides what to do about the Trump tax returns. He has to file a notice with the Senate Finance Committee and with the House Ways and Means Committee right now, saying that 30 days from now, he will revoke that, he will resume or take back the power away from the IRS commissioner to deal with these tax returns.
That is the understanding that I have of the law, confirmed by legal officials who have served in the relevant tax positions in the past.
And
I do not think it would be appropriate for a Secretary of the Treasury to become involved in the resolution of a matter of this kind.
And knowing the way the Treasury Department works, there's a council, but there are also some people working, as I understand it, kind of in the mid-level of an office like that, who've been there for years through different administrations, who really have institutional expertise about this. Would you expect that what you're telling us now has already found its way to Secretary Mnuchin, that he should have been made aware of what you know about this even before your op-ed piece came out? I
can't know that for sure. I imagine different secretaries operate differently. Certainly on matters of this kind, we would always have been very careful to seek the guidance of and presumptively to follow the guidance of career officials. And certainly career officials are familiar with the long history of the concept of independence of main Treasury from individual taxpayer matters.
And you make the point that while you were Treasury Secretary, you never had to worry about or think about something. And you explain in your piece why. Could you remind the audience why you, as Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, never had to think about it?
President Clinton made all his tax returns publicly available. All the presidents for the last 50 years have made all their tax returns publicly available. So this kind of issue would have been, couldn't possibly have arisen. It's only arisen because this president has chosen not to make his tax returns publicly available, which was his prerogative. But it is also the prerogative of the Congress as part of their oversight function. And one of their oversight functions is making sure that presidential tax returns are adequately monitored and audited, especially in light of the fact that there were failures in that area during the Nixon administration, for which reason they have requested access to the president's tax return. And by the way, this is something that's been considered extensively. This isn't something new. The relevant statute, 6103, dates from 1924. Congress, during the time I was in the Treasury Department in the 90s, passed the IRS Restructuring Act, and as part of that IRS Restructuring Act, they made clear that any employee of the IRS who failed to comply with this law, it was what was colloquially referred to as the 10 deadly sins, would be subject to being immediately fired. So this is not something that Congress has failed to consider carefully. This is not something, these are not provisions that have never been used before. For example, were used in the investigations of bias against what was felt to be biases against conservative groups during the Obama administration by the then Republican Ways and Means Committee. So these are long-established provisions.
Lawrence Summers, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And when we come back, so what will Steve Mnuchin do about Chairman Neal's demand for the Trump tax